everybody doing? Good? Okay, so thanks for coming. I know it's a very cold day today, so it's good to see a good turnout of people who are interested in learning more about how to support refugees. I'll just briefly introduce myself. My name is Sidonia Kudo. I'm a social worker. I work as a mental health counselor at the Canadian Centre for Victims of Torture. And previous to that, I was working as a child and youth counselor at the same office. So I've worked with children, youth, families, adults, seniors, who have come to Canada as refugees and as survivors of torture and survivors of war. So I'm going to speak to you a little bit about, just a bit generally about refugees. I'm going to cover a little bit about pre-migration trauma, migration trauma, post-migration trauma, and challenges that survivors and families experience. I'm going to talk a little bit about the physical and the psychological impact of trauma on survivors, families, and communities. And then I'm going to end talking a little bit about suggestions for best practices in trying to support refugees. So I'm going to be speaking more broadly about refugees in general, and then we're very lucky to have Mahmoud here from the Arab Community Center, who is then going to speak more specifically about providing support to Syrian refugees, touching on issues of culture and language and things that are important to consider when working with that population specifically. Okay? So I'm first just going to give you a little bit of context about the agency that I work for, the types of clients that I see, so that you understand who I'm referencing when I speak about refugees and survivors. So CCVT aids survivors in overcoming the lasting effects of torture and war. In partnership with the community, the Centre supports survivors in the process of successful integration into Canadian society, works for their protection and integrity, and raises awareness of the continuing effects of torture and war on survivors and their families. And we like to say that CCVT gives hope after the horror. Just a little bit about our programs and services, and some information about the history of the agency. The agency started in the late 70s in a very organic, grassroots way. Medical professionals, lawyers, and social service professionals started to see more and more refugees who had very unique and complex mental health and settlement needs. And these were refugees who were survivors of torture. Not all refugees have experienced torture. About 30% of refugees have. And so that's really how the organization started, in this very grassroots way. Over the years, the Centre has provided services to over 24,000 survivors of torture and survivors of war from over 150 different countries. Just in the last year, we saw clients from over 90 countries around the world. And the Centre provides a variety of services, including mental health counseling, settlement counseling. We have psychiatrists who are able to provide documentation, assessment, treatment at the Centre. We have language and skills training. We have a very rich children and youth program, and also a volunteer program where clients can get tutoring, befriending, and those types of social supports in the community. So just to, again, give you a little bit of background on the types of clients that we see at the Centre and who I'm going to be referring to. The word torture has a very specific definition that's set out by the UN Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment and Punishment. And so torture is described as an act that causes severe pain or suffering, whether it's physical or mental, that is purposeful, that's done to obtain a confession, to extract information, to punish, to discriminate, to coerce. And it's also done with the consent or acquiescence of somebody who is acting in a official capacity. And so what that would mean is that somebody who is enacting violence in a state-sanctioned way, right? So that would be somebody like a police officer or a military official. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about torture. And some of the clients that we see at the Centre, do fit this mandate. There are individuals who may have, for example, experienced political persecution, religious persecution based on their sexual orientation, gender identity, etc., and may have been detained in their country of origin because of those things, and experienced physical or psychological violence in that context. We also, however, see clients who have not experienced necessarily state-sanctioned violence, but have experienced violence at the hands of very powerful, organized, well-funded groups. So sometimes a client might say that they have experienced violence not from their state, but from a rebel group, a militia group, a group that engages in organized terror in their country of origin, and that's why that they had to flee. So we also see those clients at the center. And so we use the World Health Organization's concept of organized violence also to figure out whether a client fits our mandate at the center. And that definition is the interhuman infliction of significant avoidable pain and suffering by an organized group according to a declared or implied strategy and or system of ideas and attitudes. It comprises any violent action that is unacceptable by general human standards and related to the victim's feelings. So we see survivors of torture, survivors of organized violence at the center, and then finally we also see survivors of war. So individuals who may not have been directly targeted, let's say by the state, who maybe were not directly targeted for violence, but who were witness to the sights and sounds of conflict and war. So of course, many of the Syrian refugees that are arriving in Canada would fit that group. And I should also mention that we see survivors and their family members. So we also service not only survivors, but also spouse and children, even if they were not directly impacted or directly witnessed violence. This slide is just to give you a little bit of context about the types of pre-migration trauma that people may have experienced if they are survivors of torture, if they were detained in their country of origin. It's important to know that each survivor that we meet at the center and that you might meet in your own work has an individual narrative, and there's really no way to know what their experience is unless they share it with you. But these are some of the common techniques of physical and psychological torture that clients have reported to us that they experienced, often within the context of being detained, again, because of their political ideology or religious ideology or other parts of their identity. In line with that, other clients have described other types of violence that they've been exposed to. And this could include things like, disappearance of people, it could be disappearance of neighbors, of friends, of family. It could be interrogation of friends and family, of neighbors. It could be military or police raids in the community, massacres, etc. So that's a little bit about pre-migration trauma, some of the things that people may have been exposed to in their country of origin before fleeing their country of origin. And sometimes I meet with clients and their migration history is clear-cut. Sometimes clients will say I was able to, flee to a neighboring country and then very quickly get to Canada. Whereas other clients might have much more complex migration histories. And so that's important also to keep in mind when you're working with clients, that there's not only the pre-migration trauma to be conscious of, but there's also potentially trauma that the person may have experienced en route to Canada. So for example, some clients might describe that many clients will say, I left my country of origin, I fled to a neighboring country, and in that neighboring country I lived in hiding for many, many months because they knew that if they were caught in the neighboring country by, let's say, the police in that country, that they'd be deported back to their country of origin. So clients might describe that they have experienced many months, sometimes years, living in hiding in fear of their security in a neighboring country after fleeing their country of origin. Other clients might experience many months or many years of living in refugee camps in neighboring countries. So for example, I've worked with one woman who shared with me that she spent, I think, from the age of 3 to the age of 20 in a refugee camp. So living almost 2 decades in a refugee camp before being resettled into Canada. And of course, we know that the conditions in refugee camps are often very poor. People describe a lack of medicine, a lack of food, a lack of safety. Many of the young women and older women who I have worked with who have lived in refugee camps have described incidences of rape and sexual assault within refugee camps. So it's important to know that that could be part of the migration trauma, the migration experience that people are bringing before they come to Canada. Many clients have also experienced detention at various borders as they're trying to get to a safe space. So I've had clients describe to me that, again, en route to trying to get to a safe country, to a country where they can claim asylum, because not all countries, of course, have like an asylum system and a way to kind of secure status. Clients have said, I went to this country and then I was detained at the border and I spent 3 months in immigration detention in that country, and then I went to another country and then I was detained there and I spent 6 months in detention in that country. And so there are many clients where this is the narrative, where they have experienced detention multiple times in multiple spaces. And sometimes even, this isn't relevant so much for Syrian refugees because they'll be coming to Canada with permanent resident status, which is fantastic. But other refugees, even in Canada, might appear at our borders, and if they don't have enough documentation and paperwork, sometimes also experienced immigration detention within this country. And what I have found working with people who have experienced multiple detentions across countries, that has a very serious effect on someone's sense of safety and well-being, and often there are, negative mental health outcomes that come as a result of that. Of course, people also during the period of migration are exposed to a variety of other forms of exploitation. So people might be exposed to things like human trafficking, which might include forced labor, sexual exploitation. People might be exposed to physical assault, again, sexual assault, bribery, false promises by agents who will say, if you give me $10,000, I'll get you to this country, and then you give them the money and then they disappear, etc. So there's multiple different types of migration trauma people may have endured. I always think about a young woman that I worked with who was, she was I think 16 or 17 when she came to Canada. She was originally from a country in East Africa, and when she told me her migration story, it was really astonishing that she had been through all of this at such a young age. She described that she had fled her country of origin. She lived in a neighboring country in hiding for many months. Eventually she was able to meet somebody who got her documentation to get out, but she didn't come directly to Canada. She ended up going to Brazil and then made her way through bus, train, all sorts of ways, up through South America, Central America, through the US, and eventually to Canada, where she had family, and so she was trying to get to Canada so that she could be connected. And she did this by herself at a very, very young age, navigating that on her own. So of course you can imagine the type of trauma that can have on a young person. I'm going to speak just very briefly about some of the impacts of torture and organized violence on individuals. Many of our clients sometimes do live with long-term physical impacts of violence. Clients might describe things like having chronic back pain, having migraines, chronic headaches. They might experience things like visual or hearing impairments, sterility, etc., as a result of the violence that they experienced. Some of this you wouldn't know unless somebody told you. I met a man very recently who had experienced torture in his country of origin, I'd say 20 years ago, a very, very long time ago. Looked good, looked healthy, but he told me that he has been living with very serious chronic pain as a result of the torture he experienced 20 years ago his whole life. And he struggles with that every single day, right, in Canada. And that affects, obviously, his ability to work, his ability to have relationships. It's affecting him long term. So it's important to keep in mind that for some people, not all, but for some clients, there sometimes are long-term physical impacts of the violence that they have experienced. There are, of course, also psychological impacts of torture and organized violence. So this is a long list, but generally what I say is that when I meet with someone, they don't normally have all of the symptoms that are on this list. But generally, when I do meet with people who are especially very new to the country, they generally have at least a few of the symptoms on the list, which makes a lot of sense, right? What I like to say is that these are very normal reactions to abnormal situations, that anybody who had experienced the trauma of torture, organized violence, the trauma of migration, the trauma of trying to resettle into a new country, navigating a new society without knowing anybody, is probably going to experience at least a few of these symptoms. So these are quite natural reactions to abnormal situations, but it's good to be conscious that these are symptoms that might arise. There are some things that are very common. Many of my clients sometimes do struggle with mistrust, and what I always say to service providers is that that is completely justified and it makes a lot of sense. The clients that I see have experienced state-sanctioned violence. They have experienced violence at the hands of authority figures in their country of origin, and so really there's no reason for them to trust you. Especially, I don't think of myself as an authority figure. I'm just a social worker at a community center, but I understand how I could be perceived as an authority figure in an interaction with somebody who is very new, who doesn't have a lot of information about how Canadian society works. And so it's important to be conscious of that and also understand that any kind of mistrust is very understandable and very justified. I'm going to talk very briefly about PTSD. I'm sure many of you have heard about PTSD. It's important to be conscious of what the symptoms of PTSD are. Indeed, some refugees that we do see do have PTSD. They fit the diagnosis. Their symptoms fit the diagnosis of PTSD. But what I will say about PTSD is PTSD doesn't really capture the experiences of refugees. The diagnosis of PTSD was created out of Western medicine. Most of the research, I believe, around PTSD has been done with, for example, veterans, like people who were soldiers, or people who experienced perhaps single incident traumas. And so it's important to note that the wide-ranging traumas that refugees are coming with from their country of origin, the trauma of migration, the trauma again of resettlement, that this doesn't really capture that, right? So sometimes it's a useful diagnosis if somebody's very unwell and is not functioning very well and perhaps does need a psychiatric diagnosis that does need longer term treatment. But it's just important to be kind of wary of just stamping PTSD on everything. There is a psychiatrist at the center, and I'm going to steal this from her. She likes to say that most refugees probably don't need to see a psychiatrist, right? That with enough social support, enough holistic and community support, are probably able to get on with their lives and work towards their goals. That it's only really if people are showing a lot of impairment in their ability to, for example, work, whether that's go to work or go to ESL class, their ability to love, that's have relationships with spouse, children, family, etc., or have impairments with play, like if they can't enjoy anything anymore, if they're really just experiencing a complete loss of pleasure, they can't find enjoyment in reading or running like they used to. If people are really showing severe impairments and are just in bed sleeping all day, which does happen, I have clients who do experience those more serious impairments, then they might need psychiatric intervention. Diagnosis and treatment might make sense, but for other people it might not. So it's just important to be conscious of that. It's important to note how trauma affects learning, and this is particularly important for newcomers who often the first thing that they do is they are shuffled to ESL class, maybe to learn English if they don't know any English, or to skills training programs, etc. And something that we see a lot with our clients at CCVT is that many clients do struggle with issues of memory. And we know there's lots of research that shows that trauma impacts memory, the ability to retain information, the ability to process information. And so I've had clients, for example, say to me that, I went to ESL class, I thought I was paying attention, or I thought that I was remembering, and then when I went home and I looked at the paperwork that I was given, it was like nothing computed. I didn't remember anything that the teacher had said to me. Other clients might say that they have a very hard time concentrating in class. So I've had many clients say, I've tried to go to ESL, I've tried to pay attention, but I just can't, right? I'm physically there, my body is there, but my mind is not there. They're dissociating, right? They're thinking about things back home, or they're thinking about other stresses. And again, these are very common symptoms. They're so common that actually at CCVT, we don't have full day ESL classes, because we know that for our clients, especially those who are quite new to Canada, it's very difficult to maintain focused attention for 8 hours a day. I mean, even in the last 10 minutes, I'm sure half of you have dissociated a little bit, come back to the presentation, gone here, gone there, and that's natural. Our mind does that, right? But for people with trauma, to sit there for 8 hours and try to compute information the whole time is very difficult. So we actually only have half-day classes, 9 to 12 or 12:30 to 3:30, because it's a lot more manageable for clients. There's some other things that can happen also. So many clients may have had their learning interrupted from an early age. So many clients will report that, I went to school for a little bit, but then the war broke out, so I had to stop for 6 months. I had to relocate to another area of the country. I went to school for another year, but then conflict broke out again, and I had to move to a different part. So for many clients, their learning has been interrupted multiple times. And of course, we're going to be seeing lots of Syrian families. We know that many of the children and youth have been out of school for probably extended periods of time. So, and that of course impacts learning. Lack of confidence and lack of motivation is also something that can come up. So I didn't mention this earlier, but Torture is torture is used by states in a very purposeful way, right? So torture is used by states to suppress dissent, to maintain control, to maintain the status quo. And so on a collective level, it helps to disenfranchise populations to keep people quiet. On an individual level, when somebody is tortured, what happens is that it degrades the person's sense of self, their self-esteem, their self-concept. And when you have a degraded sense of self, you're having feelings of shame, for example, and many clients will say, I feel ashamed about what happened to me. Sometimes what can happen is a lack of confidence or a lack of sense of that I can do this. So I've had clients say, like, I've tried to go to ESL, I tried to learn, but I just can't. And it's just so hard, what's the point, right? So sometimes trauma can impact learning in that way also. And then my job, of course, is to help to motivate, to help encourage, to help support, to put support structures in place to make sure that the person feels like they can. But that is something that sometimes happens. There's also just issues of fatigue. So many of our clients struggle with like sleeplessness. I have many clients who will tell me I sleep 1 hour a night, 2 hours a night, 3 hours a night only. And so when they're in class, again, they're trying to focus, but they're tired, they're really, really sleepy. And so that comes up a lot also. Many clients, if they do struggle with like hypervigilance, so some clients struggle with always kind of like having very high anxiety, being on high alert. And that is one of the symptoms associated with PTSD, like hyperarousal symptoms. That can make it very difficult to process information because it's hard to process new information and retain information if you're always functioning at high anxiety. I'm going to talk a little bit about, so that's a little bit about the effect of trauma on individuals, some of the individual symptoms that might come up. I'm going to talk a little bit about the effect of trauma on families and family functioning. So sometimes this can be more frequent than direct trauma. So often when I worked with children, many of the children I worked with hadn't been, some of them had, but many of them had not been directly tortured. But they might be living in a family where one of the parents had been a torture survivor, or one of the siblings, one of the older kids had been. And this can have a disorganizing impact on families. So, this doesn't happen all the time. I always say, there are so many refugee parents that are doing fantastic jobs and don't need any additional support or help. But sometimes for clients, especially now I work as a mental health counselor, so I tend to see clients who have more serious mental health or addiction concerns at the center. And for some clients who are really struggling with depression, with PTSD symptoms, etc., that can definitely impact the parenting of the caregiver. So, for example, I have clients who will say, I do spend all day in bed because I'm so depressed, and so it's hard for me to, go to the pick up my child from school every day, or it's hard for me to be engaged and try to help them with their homework, right? So it's important to know that the trauma can affect the family in that way. In addition, family trauma can also make communication within the family difficult. I'm going to speak a little bit about this in the next slide, about kind of how taboos and secrets can be produced in societies where it's not safe to really be open about your beliefs and your values, etc. But sometimes when there is trauma in the family, there are things that are not discussed. So, for example, I've worked with families where one of the children, for example, was born of rape during a time of conflict and a time of war. And the child might always feel like, I'm treated a little bit differently, or there's something that doesn't feel right but is unsaid. And those types of things are felt in families and can impact family functioning. For families that have experienced trauma, it can also change the child's role in the family by making them assume parental responsibilities and adult status. So, for example, I've had many adult clients who are very compromised because of vulnerable mental health, who will say that I forgot about the appointment to see you. It was my 12-year-old daughter who woke me up this morning and told me, hey, you have to see Sidonia today. You have an appointment at 10 a.m. Or children who end up doing a lot of the interpretation work, etc. For families. And so that can radically change a child's status in the family and really kind of like mess with the power balance between parents and children. And the problem with some of that is that children, depending on age and depending on maturity, might not have the intellectual, the emotional maturity to be able to handle all of the things that they're being exposed to. They might be able to do some of the interpretation, they can practically do it, but are they going to be able to process it at home as a 10-year-old, hearing the things that they heard at the doctor's office, for example? And I'm going to speak briefly about social trauma. So, I talked about the effect of trauma on individuals, the effect of trauma on families, and trauma also can affect societies on a collective level. So, for example, if you know that your neighbor was very politically active, was a political activist, very open about their feelings, and then one day the police came and arrested your neighbor, and you never saw your neighbor again, you learn very quickly that there are certain things that you cannot talk about, that you probably can't trust a lot of people with your personal beliefs, etc. And so what happens is that in societies of this nature, taboo subjects are identified about which it is difficult to speak, and it becomes very difficult to trust other people. And there's an example here. So children often learn at a very early age to identify taboo subjects. Confiding in others and trust in general may be systematically perceived as a potential danger, since no one knows where and who the enemies are. And this goes back to what I said, that some clients do have difficulty trusting, but again, it's justified given the context that they may be coming from. Something that can also happen as a result of kind of growing up in a context of violence is that individuals might accommodate to the values which surround them, either to live in fear of what might happen and what they have heard, or to normalize the violent circumstances through taking such violence as the model of life. So I often give the example of, I was working with also a young woman who was, I think came to Canada at the age of 17. She had fled her country of origin was a country that had been impacted by war for decades. But she had actually fled because she started to become politically active as a youth, and as a result of becoming politically active, she was targeted, she was detained, she was tortured in the context of detention, and she had to flee her country of origin as a result. And when I met with her, she told me that that's why she left her country of origin, that it became too unsafe for her to stay. Because she'd become a political activist, she had to leave because she was being, individually targeted. As part of some of the services that she got at the center, she was going through a refugee claim at the time. She saw one of the psychiatrists at the center to get some medical documentation to help support her asylum claim. And when she met with the doctor, she had much more time with the doctor. The doctor spent several hours with her asking, many detailed questions about her life history, about everything she'd been through, etc. And I remember, and when I had seen her, I'd asked her, were there other traumatic events in your life? Were there other difficult things that had happened to you? And she kind of just said, no, it was really this traumatic event of being detained, being tortured in detention, and that's why I had to leave. But after she saw the psychiatrist and I was able to read over the psychiatric notes, I saw in fact that she had actually experienced multiple traumas throughout her life. So for example, she talked about, having to miss school for many years because of having to relocate because of conflict. She talked about neighbors disappearing. She talked about family members disappearing. She talked about seeing dead bodies on the street as a child growing up. But it was interesting to me at the time to note that she didn't describe any of this to me. And when I'd asked her, were there other things that had happened to you? Were there other things that you had been exposed to? But of course, this had been her whole life, right? So she kind of just took this as, this is what life is, right? This is how society functions. This is what I'm being exposed to every single day. And that makes sense, right? It's a type of kind of protective mechanism to do that if you're being exposed to chronic violence. So I'll speak a little bit about some of the post-migration traumas that refugees are exposed to once they settle in Canada. So definitely the challenges are not over even after they have arrived and presumably safe. There are a variety of settlement issues that come up with for refugees in the first months and I would say years of resettling into a new country. So most of the clients that I work with struggle with poverty, right? So very new to the country, don't have the language skills yet, might need upgrading in terms of education or skills training. And so definitely struggling with poverty is a huge issue. Immigration status is huge. This won't be huge for the Syrian refugees, of course, because they're coming with permanent resident status. Although it might be an issue for 4 to 5 years from now when they're applying for citizenship and are aghast at how high the citizenship fees are, or when they need kind of help processing that. Lack of housing is a huge one. So most of the clients that I work with live in totally inadequate housing. I often give the example of a client that I worked with who he lived in subsidized housing in the city. He was able to get subsidized housing, but he was given a bachelor unit that had no windows. So it was very tiny and had no windows. And he would describe that living in that bachelor unit reminded him of being in detention in his country of origin, which makes sense. It's like a dark room, it's small, etc. And so when he was there, he would have flashbacks, he would dissociate, he would have nightmares. He was extremely uncomfortable in this space. And as a result, he already had some issues with alcoholism, but as a result, he started to drink more heavily, right? So literally the lack of housing, the lack of appropriate housing was perpetuating his past trauma, making his trauma symptoms worse, and resulting in kind of maladaptive coping, right? So, I mean, that's just an example of how inappropriate housing can make resettlement much more challenging for refugee clients. Thankfully, eventually we were able to get this person out of this housing into more appropriate housing, and he's doing like so much better. It's amazing how much better he's doing. Other barriers include a lack of information about one's rights, a lack of information about how to navigate Canadian society, a lack of information about how to access services or what services are available to them. Uncertain future is often a big one. Again, it's, this is definitely true for people who have precarious immigration status, who are not sure if they're going to be able to stay or what's going to happen. But even for people who do have secure immigration status in the country, there's the uncertainty of what is my life going to look like. I had to leave everything behind. I left behind my job. I left behind, the education that I had attained, my culture, my language, my social structures, my social supports. What is life in Canada going to look like? Some of the barriers to accessing services can also, I've mentioned this already, distrust of authority and societal systems. So, and again, I think that this makes a lot of sense given the experiences of the clients that I see. And I always say, there's no reason for people to trust me. Many of my clients are not coming from countries where a social worker exists, where that's a thing that you can access. Some are, but many are not. And so, even accessing help from a stranger at a community center can be a bit of a weird thing. There's also, in all communities, newcomer and Canadian-born communities, there's stigma around talking about mental health. And so that can also be a barrier in accessing services, even if people are struggling with mental health symptoms. Many of my clients also, they might be struggling with mental health symptoms, but sometimes they don't actually know that there's the connection between how they're feeling and past trauma. And that seems strange, but that is true. Clients will say, I have headaches all the time, I feel very depressed, and I don't really know why, right? And so part of the work that I do is helping clients connect, their experiences and how they're feeling and relating everything together. Lack of family reunification is also a huge barrier to resettlement and feeling well even after somebody is in Canada. So many of the clients that I see have fled their country of origin by themselves. They are leaving behind spouse, they're leaving behind children. And we know that even if somebody is able to stay and have permanent residence in Canada, that bringing your spouse and children to Canada sometimes takes years. I have clients who've been waiting 4, 5, 6, 7 years. And so you can imagine the kind of stress that has on the mental health of somebody who is concerned about the safety of their family back home. Family might still be in a precarious situation in country of origin, or they might be in a precarious situation in a neighboring country. And so that has very serious ramifications for somebody's mental health and their ability to move forward. Language, of course, we know is a barrier. Social isolation is huge. Again, many of the clients I work with have come to Canada by themselves. At CCVT, we do have a befriending program where we're able to match clients with a volunteer in the community or with a tutor in the community to help with language acquisition. Because many of the clients that we work with, they don't have any social supports or any social networks. There's also issues of identity, belonging, living in exile. So many clients will talk about struggling with issues of cultural identity, kind of not knowing how much of Canadian culture to adapt to, or how much to, that kind of balancing act. There's of course also wider systemic issues. So the clients that we're seeing are also trying to navigate Canadian systems that are sometimes very oppressive. They're dealing with things like racism, xenophobia, transphobia, homophobia, et cetera, while trying to find housing, while trying to access appropriate healthcare services, et cetera. So we have to also be conscious of that. And just very brief, I spoke very briefly about this already, but sometimes as a result of settlement challenges, within families, intergenerational conflicts can present in families. So, and this often happens if children and youth have been taking a more kind of powerful role in the family, doing the interpretation, doing a lot of those major tasks. Sometimes it can be then difficult for parents to feel like they have control in the household, that children are abiding by their rules, etc. I'm going to get a little bit theoretical for a second, but then I'm going to get very practical, so bear with me. This is just to give you a little bit of information about. So at CCVT, we don't use a medical model in terms of providing services to refugees. We do have psychiatrists and some medical doctors who come to the center to provide assessment and treatment if needed for people who do need that kind of help. But generally, we like to have a more holistic model. And our model of service is based on the work of Martin Barreau. He was a Jesuit psychologist, I believe. He's now deceased. And he wrote a lot about trauma and trauma cultures. And he talked about how trauma, the nature of trauma rests in social origins. So he said that, trauma isn't in individuals, right? Which is very different from kind of Western society that says you have PTSD, this is the label that you have, et cetera. He talked about how trauma originates in societies, in the collective. And that to treat trauma, you have to treat both the individual and the social causes that are causing the trauma. And he wrote about how trauma will remain chronic when the factors that brought about it remain intact. So he wrote quite a lot about trauma cultures, and he said that trauma cultures are cultures that they flourish when there's a lot of inequality in societies, when there's social polarization, when there are institutional lies, and when organized violence and war damage individuals and their families and personal networks. So what does that look like? So in a trauma culture, what that looks like on an individual level, a survivor potentially represses their experience. They might not think that they're going to be understood or believed if they share their experiences of torture. They might not want to talk about their experiences in order to protect others from the painful event. Or they might not want to concede power to the tortured by admitting to traumatic consequences. At a family level, what that looks like is the family might never want to talk about the trauma, and that I hear that a lot also, where clients or families will say, like, is there a pill I can take that will make it go away, or is there a way for me to just forget that this happened? And of course, I have to work with clients and talk about how there's really no way to forget. There's a way to try to cope. There's a way to try to build it into your narrative of your life. But there's really no way to kind of put things under the rug and forget and try to forget that it happened. Families might want to, again, just go forward and forget the traumatic event, or they might isolate from relatives, from friends, and support services. On a community level, what that looks like in a trauma culture is the community might choose to ignore what happens. They might feel threatened and fearful to intervene. And again, I talked about how if you're in a society and you know that it's not safe to talk about certain things, that certain people are experiencing violence or disappearing because they were active or because they were challenging the status quo, you very quickly learn that it's too scary to try to engage in that. People in the community might feel powerless to assist or change circumstances. They might blame the victim, which happens, right, scapegoating. Or they might say they don't want to be concerned with outside issues. Alternatively, in societies that do recognize trauma, that recognize the impact of oppression, individuals would find understanding and support. They would learn coping skills to buffer traumatic events. They would learn to construct a meaning around trauma. And they would be positively acknowledged by family and society. On a family level, families would develop understanding about the trauma and the impact of trauma. They would acquire supportive skills, recognize the traumatic effects on the family, and also form links to the community. And on a community level, what that would look like if communities, again, recognize trauma, recognize the occurrence of torture, the impact it has. Communities would provide opportunities for justice and recognition. They would make sure that education, health, and social services are available and accessible. They would create conditions to initiate social reconciliation and establish commemorative practices to recognize survivors and those who did not survive. So, at CCVT, we use this model of circles of support as kind of the backbone when we're trying to plan programs and services at the center. So some basic tips before I leave it to Mahmoud. Some basic tips about if you are working with refugees, with Syrian refugees or refugees in general. It's really wonderful that there's now so much focus on the topic of refugees, and I think Syrian refugees have really brought it to the forefront, and it's in the media. But it's important to remember that refugees have been coming to Canada for a long time, and we continue to have many refugees from all over the world, and so I think it's in all of our best interest to know how to best support refugees from everywhere. So some tips for service providers. So one is to minimize potential stressors. I mean, this is a little bit difficult. All clients are going to have individual triggers, right? So, clients might have certain triggers that could be sights or sounds or smells, et cetera, that remind them of past trauma. And it really, unless someone shares that with you, it's impossible for you to know that or what that person's individual triggers might be. But it's important to just be conscious and sensitive to the idea that there might be environmental factors that are going to trigger somebody. So for example, the example I gave of the person who was in a closed room with no windows and how something like that might be triggering for somebody. It's very important when you're working with survivors, and this is going to be different again depending on what your role is, if you're a worker, if you're a volunteer, if you're somebody who's engaged in a sponsorship group, to be very clear about what your role and the way it may be appropriate for you to respond to the person given that role. So again, I often meet with people who they've never met with a social worker before, they've never met with a counselor before. So sometimes I have to do a little bit of explaining about what my role is, what I do, what I'm available, what kinds of services and programs I can provide to them, what kind of information I can give, what is this relationship going to be like, how do I relate to the person. It is important to set boundaries, to be clear about what you can offer and what you can't accomplish. So yes, I can help with mental health, or I can help with settlement. No, I can't go for a coffee later, so that people kind of understand what the boundaries of the relationship are. It's important to avoid being paternalistic, and it seems very obvious, but I think if you know how Canadian society works, you know how to navigate things, you have your own set ideas of what you think might potentially be helpful for somebody who is very new and needs a lot of information about how to get settled. But it's really important to really be client-centered, to ask the person what they expect from you, what kinds of services do they need, rather than make assumptions about what is helpful. And really go at the person's pace, because in your mind you're thinking about, okay, education, employment, immigration, there's all these things that that the person is potentially going to need help with. But you really want to go at their pace and make sure that you're not guided by your own ideas of what is helpful. And again, don't rush things or offer more help than is necessary at the time, so that's in line with that. It's important to remember that survivors have, and I mentioned this before, very different experiences. They represent every type of personality, every level of functioning, have experienced different types of persecution. So, Mahmoud's going to speak a little bit more about Syrian refugees, but even within the Syrian population, you might have heard one narrative, but everyone has a different narrative, right? So even within the same country, people in the same culture, people who are speaking the same language, have the same religion. It's very easy, especially if you're seeing many people from a very homogenous caseloads, to kind of make assumptions about, oh, they must have experienced this or that. But really, it's only unless the person shares with you what their narrative is that you know what type of violence that they were exposed to, and what their pre-migration, migration, and post-migration traumas have been like. It's really important to treat survivors not simply as victims, but really as survivors. So the person that you're working with, they got to Canada, right? That takes a lot of strength and a lot of resilience, right? That person has probably been showing a lot of grit for years, trying to manage a variety of traumas. And so you really want to treat the person as a very competent individual, right? So this is not a victim, this is somebody who has survived a tremendous amount of tremendous challenges and is now sitting in front of you looking for help to rebuild their life. And so you want to make sure to focus on capacities that got them through the ordeal, especially during times where a client is maybe feeling a little bit weaker, not feeling so great, feeling maybe less like I spoke to you before. Sometimes a client might be feeling like, what's the point? I can't get through this, etc. So really focus on the capacities that got them through the ordeal and assist them in connecting with their innate resiliency, because they're an extremely resilient population. It's also important to ensure that the agency of the individual is respected in all manners possible, so working from a strengths-based and empowerment approach. For example, communicating procedures and plans clearly, ensuring they've been understood, ensuring that survivors have been able to make decisions for themselves about their own level of care. And this is really important because survivors, especially those who've experienced detention, were probably in situations where they did not have any control, where decisions were being made for them and things were being done to them without their consent. So it's really important to always communicate things very well to survivors about what's going to be done, what you can help them with, what their role is, and make sure that they're able to make decisions for themselves. It's also very important to assure things like confidentiality. So of course, if you're a worker, you always do confidentiality. You talk about the limits to confidentiality when you're working with a client. But with survivors, this is particularly important because many clients might be very fearful about where the information that you're collecting, let's say during an intake, where it's going. So I've had clients, for example, say like, sometimes I'm scared that the information that is being collected by whoever, is being shared with our government, and maybe how do I know that our government isn't sharing it with my government back home? And that can be very scary for people who maybe still have family back home and they're scared about the safety of their family back home, or for people who have said, many clients have said like nobody back home actually knows where I am, so it's not safe for anybody to know that I'm in Canada. So it's important to note confidentiality and where, if you're collecting information like during an intake, like where is that information going? Why do you need it? In line with that, it's good to avoid intrusive questioning. And again, this is sometimes difficult. If you're doing, for example, an intake. I was doing a presentation recently with Ontario Works Workers, and I was talking about like the need to avoid intrusive questioning and to explain procedures and why you're collecting information. And the manager was like, oh God, we do this all wrong, because if you're signing up for Ontario Works, they ask you about your assets, about who's the father of your child, like lots of nitty-gritty information, which can be really like intrusive and kind of scary, particularly for survivors who may have experienced interrogation in their country of origin. So to be asked kind of back-to-back questions from an authority figure could be very, very scary for somebody who experienced that kind of like a similar type of questioning in a very different and violent context in their country of origin. So it's good to try to be sensitive. If you're trying to get information, try to do it in an open-ended way to encourage dialogue, to guide information, and again, clearly explain like what information is required and why. Some other general tips. So, it's best, unless your role with the person is like a counselor or a mental health counselor, or you're going to be working with the person for a more extended period of time, it's best to only ask trauma-related questions if it's really relevant to your task. So, if it's not relevant to what you're doing with the person, if you're an employment counselor and you're helping the person with a resume, there's no reason to try to get into the nitty-gritty of like what their past was like. It's not appropriate. Unless the person, of course, shares that with you, that's not something that you would be asking about. It's always important, of course, to use active listening skills to validate clients' expressions of distress if they do express distress, to offer sensitive, empathic, and non-judgmental understanding. So again, this goes back to, survivors don't necessarily expect to feel that they're going to be understood or that they're going to be validated, because they might be coming from contexts where people don't talk about trauma, where things are hidden, right? So it's very important to provide that understanding and to provide that validation. It's also important to normalize survivors presenting problems and symptoms. So something that I do when I'm working with clients and they'll talk about the symptoms that they're having is again to mention that the symptoms are normal, that it's not the symptoms that are abnormal, it's what happened back home that was completely abnormal, and that the way that they're reacting is just the way that the mind and body tries to process trauma. Again, it's important to respond sensitively and empathically to disclosures of trauma or expressions of distress. Ensure that survivors know that you believe their disclosures. Be aware and sensitive to the fact that culture can impact survivors' beliefs and ideas about causes of distress, symptoms of distress, and ways of regulating emotions. And I think Mahmoud's going to talk a little bit about that with regards to Syrian refugees and how we know that cross-culturally people express distress in lots of different ways, right? So in some cultures, somebody might say, I feel sad. In another culture, somebody might just say, I have headaches, right? Like it's very, very, very different. So just being conscious and sensitive to that. It's important to reinforce also the here and now, especially if people are very new and just trying to resettle. There's some, I've read some research before that, you know, refugees that focus on the present and also are a little bit more future focused sometimes do better than those who do a lot of ruminating about the past. Of course, it's important to educate yourself about country conditions, cultural and religious factors if you are seeing clients that are many clients from a particular region in the world, and educate yourself on community resources available for additional support. And finally, you know, this sounds very basic, but I always say, you know, when you're working with somebody who is quite new, who is a refugee, they have experienced multiple losses. They have lost family, they've lost friends, social connections, employment, you know, like lots of material and also immaterial things. And so, you know, part of my job, for example, at CCVT is making sure that people are well connected in lots of different ways to education, to employment, to their internal resources, to opportunities for recreation, to social connections, etc., because I'm helping them rebuild a life, right? And when you think about your life, there's lots of different aspects of it. And so you want to do, you know, some of these things, right? Like helping with immigration if immigration issues are a concern, helping with mental health if that's a concern, encouraging language learning, and strengthening social connections, encouraging things like relaxation techniques, practicing spirituality and religion if that's important to them, finding like fun things to do, right? So sometimes I'll meet with somebody and I'll say like, what do you like to do for fun? And they'll look at me like, oh, I haven't been asked that in a long time. You know, like, do you like to play soccer? Do you like to read? Like, what are the things that you like to do just for fun? Not about learning English, not about this, or what do you like to do for fun? So that's really important also. So that's it from me. I think we're gonna leave questions till the end, maybe after Mahmoud. But thank you so much for your attention and for listening.
So how does this go on? Just put it on the back? Okay. Can I just put this in my pocket?
Yeah.
Is that right? How's this? Good enough? Cool, thanks. Alrighty. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to CCVT for asking me to come and present. It's always a pleasure to talk about my country and my culture. I am Syrian. So it's always fun to just get up here and start telling you really cool, interesting facts that you probably had no idea about. You're gonna be laughing, you're gonna be in a serious mood, it's gonna be all over the place. But thank you to Sidonia for sort of setting the stage. Yeah, we've decided to go broad and then now focus on the Syrians. And I'm gonna give you basically a very sort of descriptive characterization of the Syrian people to the best of my ability. I'm not gonna make it all rosy and say, oh, it was, you know, we used to walk in the street and it was so nice. I'm gonna tell you the things that you need to know about who you're gonna see coming to Canada. I'm gonna set you in the right, put you in the right stage. I'm gonna compare as much as I can the Syrians with Canadians, life in Syria with life in Canada, so that you really have a good image and understanding of who are these people that are coming and what they are expecting and what they have as their backgrounds. So we'll start off by, let me just introduce myself. So Mahmoud is my name. I work for the Arab Community Center. I started off as a volunteer for them. We're a settlement agency, so we help newcomers with a lot of their things. And we're funded by the 3 levels of government. We're also the only fully Arabic staffed settlement agency in town, and I think in the province. So some of the things we help with, just briefly: orientation, information referrals, language services, citizenship classes, support circles, counseling. All our staff are trauma trained. And so basically what we're doing here is we're working with these private sponsor groups that have formed to sponsor refugee families. And so we'll work with them from the beginning, when they first form their groups, to when they receive their families. We'll go out and meet the families with them. We'll help the families enroll in all the things they need to enroll in. And then we sort of listen to their needs and just sort of follow on throughout. So we're working with almost about 100 groups right now. So you can assume about maybe 400 refugee individuals. We're not taking care of the government-assisted refugees that you're hearing about in the hotels. That is not our jurisdiction. So we stick to the private sponsorship groups for now, okay? No. Yes, okay. Okay, so to give you just a brief idea of Syria, a few main cities. They are Damascus, the capital; Aleppo, the next, I think, largest city; Homs is very large, also in Hama. These are the biggest sort of cities in Syria, and they form a line that runs north-south. The conflict started in the city of Daraa, all the way south, and now both cities, all cities, are going to have opposition-controlled areas and government-controlled areas, and that's important to know. This is the city of Aleppo. I don't know if you'll see images like this anymore in the news, because obviously of the destruction, unfortunately, but also because the news and the media are going to show you a side of things different than what you would see back before 2011. It's really hard finding these images these days, actually. So when we talk about this and we just look at this picture, the citadel of Aleppo, which dates all the way back to I think 3000 BC, so it's really old, is the center of Aleppo, and everything is around it. Here's another image from the castle, sort of onto the city, and we can see that the architecture is really different. In one area, you'd find architecture from sort of 3 or 4 different eras, from the time of the Ottoman Empire that controlled us, the French when they controlled us, the Byzantine Empire. I mean, Syria is just a host to a large range of empires and eras. And one thing I want to sort of show you here in this picture is that the way we get our cable is not the same as the way we get cable here. It's not underground through actual cables. It's through satellite dishes that each person just sort of props on their balcony or their building and then points it towards the satellite that they need, and that's how they get the cable. So things are different there. I'll say that. We have the very rich. Obviously, with every developing country, you're going to have very rich individuals, and then you have very poor individuals. And the reason I sort of tailor this conversation towards the more vulnerable people in Syria is because that's who we've seen come in to Canada. When you come in, either under the government-sponsored refugees or the privately sponsored, they are the people that, now there are family-referred cases, so I could, for example, go out there and bring my cousins, who are very educated, wealthy individuals, but as well, you have the refugees that are coming in from the camps, those that physically walked across the border and found themselves in the camps. So it's important to know that we need to cover sort of the whole spectrum of Syrian society. So we have this, right? But then we also, and we have this, homes here are also very expensive. They can go up to $1 million pre-conflict, right? But then we also have, in the same street, if we zoom, if we sort of drive back a little, we'll see the house on the right, where that house is worthless, to be honest with you. It's not worth much. And the individual working in that house would be earning a very, very low salary. The person, for example, in an apartment on the left could be making, what a CEO makes here. But the person on the right side of the street would be making much less. So even within Syria, within the same city and area, sometimes you find the very wealthy and the very rich. And that's important to note. Because a lot of people will come out to you as Syrians and tell you, we'll give you a rosy picture. And I'm trying to give you a very realistic idea of what went on in Syria. So we have sort of more rundown neighborhoods, such as these. One thing to really point out here, I don't know if you guys can see this very well, but the way our healthcare system works is a little different than here. We don't have family doctors. We just have doctors that set up their offices in buildings. So in an apartment building, you live in one side of the building, and then your neighbor next to you is a doctor's office. That's fine. Zoning is a little different there, commercial or residential. So doctors are all over the place, and you know a doctor by the sign that they'll have at the sort of the ground level of the building. A lot of these signs will say doctor this, specialized in this, dentist here, et cetera, et cetera. We either have hospitals, but we don't have clinics, and then we have doctors in sort of their own practices. And the way we access our healthcare, which I'll talk about in the future in other slides, is that you really just go and see who you need to see. There's no referral system like there is here. And that's really important to know because Syrians coming in are going to need to know that. Okay? We also have the farmlands, right? We're known for our produce. We export to neighboring countries. So you're going to have people that are going to be coming from villages such as this, for example. These villages were targeted in part of the conflict. And so if this was sort of near the border of Jordan, families from here would literally walk across the border and reside in a camp. Okay? Now let's talk about Syria just a little as a country. Let us talk about the politics and the government, just to understand the background of these people. So in terms of freedom of speech, we were known not to have the freedom to speak, basically. Unfortunately, we rank just a few ranks above North Korea, okay? And that's by the Reporters Without Borders. And the Freedom House ranks us 83 between 0 and 100 being not free at all, okay? So just to give you an idea, there is a phrase, a saying that says the walls can hear you. And so even within families, when someone starts to sort of criticize the government or the ruling party, etc., another member of the family will end the conversation just in case your neighbor can hear you. And if your neighbor, you don't know if your neighbor is an informant or not, right? So you always take your precautions. In terms of democracy as well, not much. We rank very low. The country is next to us, Saudi Arabia. I mean, Saudi Arabia is not known for their democracy. We all know that. Okay? The logo on the left is the logo of the ruling party. That's the Ba'ath Party. That's the same party that was formed by Saddam also. So he was part of that party when he took over. Economic freedom. Again, we rank below the world average, unfortunately. Property rights, freedom from corruption, very low. Investment freedom, very low. It's very hard to start a company there in Syria. Pre-conflict, because you go in, you find all these rules, all these sort of obstacles, you sort of get out and say, I'm not doing this anymore. I've heard lots of examples about companies that tried to come in and just sort of had lots of trouble setting up, either because of corruption, either because, I don't want to get into details, but let's just call it obstacles for now. To talk about the people, to give you an idea about the numbers, which you'll obviously find on Google, etc., population was 22 million. That's, I think, 2/3 of Canada's population, yet we're the size of a fraction of Ontario. So keep that in mind in terms of population density. Our median age is 22. In Canada, it's 39. So if you look at our population pyramid, it looks like this. If you look at Italy's or Canada's, for example, it looks like a rectangle, in that there's an aging population. One of the reasons people argue for the continuous immigrant populations, and I think Canada takes between 250 to 300 a year, is because Canada does have an aging population issue. And so you always need to sort of replenish with younger people. And so we have lots of kids. The birth rate is 22 out of 1,000. In Canada, it's 10 out of 1,000, right? So families used to be at 8, 9. My mom's side is 7, my dad's side is 9. Now families are more like 3 and 4 if you're in the city, just because it costs so much to raise a family. In parts of Syria where there's less education, people don't know about contraceptives, and so families end up being 8 or 9. Families up in, there's a family going to Meaford and Port Elgin up in northern Ontario, and those families, I think one is, the one at Port Elgin is 14. That's mom, dad, and 12 kids. Okay, just picture that. 12 kids, yes. So back to back kids. Literacy rate though. I take this for what it is, 85%, but keep in mind that the government did control everything. And so even my mom, who worked at the Central Bureau of Statistics back in her day, said that even she questioned some of the figures that would come out, because 85% that for a country that's lower to middle to lower middle income is pretty impressive. It really is. And we do encourage education. People are encouraged to go to school. But 85 is a very impressive number. And so if we take that as face value, we are a pretty educated population. We will see people coming into Canada, though, and we have seen lots and lots of people who have not had grade 9 education, grade 9 Arabic education, right? So while you have individuals like, I'll be honest, myself, I have a master's degree in engineering, okay? You will have people, families, or the father, who's the head of the household, with nothing but a grade 8 education. And so we're going to see everything. The ethnic composition, 90% Arabs. Now, Arab is a linguistic term, someone who speaks Arabic, but a lot of people argue that Arabic is also culture. It's a cultural thing, so it's an ethnicity. Kurds, speaking Kurdish. We have seen some families that came in that are Kurdish. We have seen families that are Armenian. Armenians are part of the minorities. Circassians are also part of the minorities. Assyrians, we have seen Assyrians. I personally, when I was in Syria, never met an Assyrian person. But I think Canada is putting priority on minorities to bring them in. And if you take a picture, to look at the picture on the left, it's really cool because it's a snapshot of sort of the daily life in a street, a busy street. You'll notice, first of all, at the shops, the signs are in Arabic because that's the major language. The major language is not Arabic and English or English-French as it is here. But English and French are taught in schools, okay? But because of lack of practice, etc., most commercials and adverts and shop signs are going to be in Arabic. Note the two boys on the left, okay? The ones holding hands. Note the two ladies on the right holding hands, and then the two people in the center, and I'll talk about them in a second. To get into the religion, really quickly, 90% Muslim. So a lot of what's Islamic culture, Islamic law, is infused into Syrian law. For example, family law is based on your religion. So when you get married, you'll go to your sort of local priest, imam, etc., and then you'll register your marriage there and then take it to the civil court. Okay? Family law, so it's, yes, is left up to your religion. Other matters, business law, contract law, is obviously, it's got its own system. So 10% Christian. You have the Yazidi community that you might have heard of in the news a couple of years ago. And there's a wide range of Christianity. Now, this map sort of is a mix of language and religion, but to give you a sort of very simplistic idea, and this is oversimplified, but it gives you a good idea that in the cities, it's a mixed composition. The Alawites, which are of the an offshoot of the Shiite part of Islam, some people will argue, is on the west coast. The Kurds up in the north. The Kurds, because there are some Kurds in Turkey as well. And then, what else do we have here? Yeah, sort of a majority Sunni population all over the country. If we zoom in a little and talk about society, and this is the part that gets really interesting. Religion is a big part of one's life. It definitely is. Okay, it's a secular state, but really people do rely on religion a lot for their everyday needs. In the conversation, you'll hear religion referred to a lot, regardless of whether you're Muslim or Christian or whatever. In terms of your the way you feel regarding mental health. For example, in Syria, it's very common that suffering is part of one's life, suffering to a certain degree. And so when it comes to mental health, in Syria, it's stigmatized. Yes, it is. And only if you sort of have extreme circumstances where someone might refer to you as majnoon or crazy is when you would seek mental health professional help, unfortunately. So if someone is sort of suffering from depression, etc., no one would consider seeing a professional for that. If I told you, go, you seem like you have a condition, why don't you go see a doctor for it? I actually might be insulting you. Some people might see that as an insult. Some people, so you got, again, varying levels of education. Some people who still see mental health as something that you go and you get a pill for, you go to the doctor, you know what I mean? Like, if you told him go see a psychiatrist, he'd think he's going to see someone who's gonna prescribe pills or ask him about physical pain. But then you have the educated side of things, people who will understand what that means and what a psychiatrist is, etc. Again, family law influenced by religion, like I said. If, in terms of inheritance, for example, if you're Muslim, you'll go by Sharia law. You won't go, there's no sort of country, codal system for inheritance. You go by your religion. In terms of family, it's a big unit. The family is a big unit. It's not your immediate, as is known here. And a daughter could be a daughter that's 30. That's fine. You still, she's still part of the family. It's not like over 18. No such thing as, non-dependent children or no such thing. A child is a child. It could be 35 living at home with you, single, married, doesn't matter. Some homes, because it's really expensive for you to go out and buy your own apartment, you might live with your parents until you're 30. You might get married and take a room in the apartment, and it'll be you and your wife and then your parents living. And so, the family unit naturally, because of different factors, does become big. An aunt might live with you. That's why a lot of these families are coming that are big, not only because of children, but because you have a mama, dad, an aunt who has lived with them for a really long time, and they couldn't leave her behind. So they're trying to bring her. The family reputation is very, very, very important. When you get asked, when you get introduced to someone, when someone asks about you, they ask about your last name. They say, "Min Beit Min," which means from whose house are you? And so your last name will indicate a lot about the area that you might be from, the wealth that you might have, the religious background that you might be from. So it says a lot. It's a small community, especially in the small villages and towns. People know each other, right? And so your last name says a lot about you. And so if you do anything that might taint that reputation, well, there are repercussions. And the repercussions can be as bad, unfortunately, and I love to give extreme cases because really those are the most interesting, but also to show you that there might be such people entering Canada, and that's important for us to know because of how much service providers need to know about education. I take it upon myself to sort of follow up with a lot of these families so that we know they are functioning within sort of the bounds and laws of Canadian society. The example I'm about to give you is really extreme, but in Syria, in some communities, divorce is so taboo that if the woman gets divorced, she might be alienated from the family, which is the easiest part, but also killed. Okay? Yeah. So now in some communities, this is absolutely ridiculous. No one believes this anymore. But in very, very traditional conservative communities, this does happen. And I'm not making this up because I heard it the other day as I was interpreting for one family. I couldn't believe it. I was very shocked, but the gentleman confirmed that had her parents and her family not been in a rebel-controlled area, and she lived in the government-controlled area, had they been in the same area and were allowed to come in, her life is in danger, right? And so you read about these in the reports that come out of the UN, come out of sort of all these other agencies that are evaluating human rights and equality, etc. And you will find very, very barbaric practices, unfortunately, and they do exist. I'm not going to lie to you and say they don't. And so that doesn't mean that that's who's coming to Canada, but I'm saying that we have all ends of the spectrum. We have the very educated people who are forward-thinking, progressive intellectuals, but then you also have the very less progressive individuals. In terms of relations, informal, and I refer to it as informal, like a boyfriend-girlfriend. That's not very common there. You meet someone, you might meet them through school, etc. Then you sort of ask for marriage, and then you just get married, get engaged, and then you get married. Opposite genders don't hug, right? They don't hug. They don't go in for a hug or a kiss if there's no relation. If you're going to say hi to someone, if you're saying hi to a guy, you shake their hand or give them a kiss on each cheek, that's fine. That has nothing to do with sexual orientation. The same thing for the women. Women can go for hugs, men can go for hugs with each other. But when it comes to the opposite gender, most times, most cases, you'll keep a distance and just say hi from distance. Right? It could be just sort of, hi, how's it going? Or hi, welcome, come on in, things like that. Only really in business or professional settings would you shake hands, and it's only if the woman extended her hand out. You wouldn't go in because a lot of reasons. It could be, she's Muslim and she prefers not to, and I could go in, that's a half an hour speech by itself. Okay, that's important to know. Public affection towards members of the same gender, not to be confused with sexual orientation. Just because I'm a guy and I hold the other guy's hand and we're friends and we walk down the street does not mean that I'm homosexual. It's different there, right? It's different. Socialization, if you're more highly educated, you're more likely to sort of converse, talk with members of the opposite gender in public, etc., outside your family, that's fine. But sort of more or less educated families, the women will tend to stay at home more, socialize with members of their own family. Help out with the family farmlands or the business, etc. So this is your middle income family having maybe seems like it's dinner at the table. Nothing looks different about this. This is what we do here. But then what about these guys? Well, these guys prefer to dine on the ground. A lot of, there was one incident here where the gentleman, the family was given an apartment. The gentleman goes out to the balcony. There's a chair there, but the gentleman chooses to sit on the floor. Now, when they asked, why are you sitting on the floor? They said, because that's what makes me more comfortable. Another incident, they furnished the apartment for the family. The sponsor group comes back in a week and finds the mattress on the floor and the bed disassembled. Why, they ask. It's because that's what makes them more comfortable, right? So I don't know why this happens, but, and I didn't tell you this, I come from two ends of the spectrum. My mom's side was very wealthy. Dad was a lawyer. They're all educated, engineers, etc. My dad's side, some of them, my uncles don't even have third grade education. My dad's side went through extreme poverty back in the 50s. He was able to make it out and attend school in the US and get a job with the UN, etc., and build a good life for me. So when I visit my family back in Syria, my dad's side, sometimes we might eat on the floor. We do it less and less now, or the last few times I saw them. But when I first used to see them, yeah, that's very common. That's very typical. Your gatherings, your evening gatherings when you have guests over, it'll be on the floor. It'll be men on one side, women on one side, right? And it'll be sort of in an L shape. And you're sitting on the floor outside in the cool summer night. That's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. We don't eat with our hands, though. A lot of Arab cultures or countries, for example, the Gulf countries, in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Yemen, they sometimes eat with their hands, the rice, the meat, etc. No, we use forks and spoons. We're not used to eating with our hands. Parenting, we parent very closely. Corporal punishment, to some extent, is common in some communities. In schools, it's forbidden, but I think some schools still do it, and law enforcement is just great. They're not going to really enforce that. Respect of elders, continuously enforced. Your elder comes into the room, you sit up straight. That's what you're taught. Obviously, some kids these days don't pay attention to that. But when I grew up, if you have your feet in the air, for example, no, I'll get to that in a second. If you're lying down watching TV, your dad comes into the room, you sort of sit up straight and you continue. It's a sign of disrespect for you to be lying down in front of your father. Do you guys remember the incident where someone threw a shoe at George Bush back? Yeah. There's a reason someone threw a shoe. There's a reason he chose a shoe. A shoe is a very disrespectful object. The underside of your foot is very disrespectful to show someone. So if I'm sitting in my office and my feet are up on my desk and someone comes in, a client, a friend, etc., if that was in Syria, I'd take them down right away. That's very disrespectful to someone. So you sit down. That's the reason why if you're lying down, your father comes in, you sort of get up. That's what most families are taught there. But back to the family, the brothers, the older siblings will take care of the younger siblings. It's very, very close-knitted. Your cousin, your older cousin, who's a guy, might take care of you, if might take care of the girls of the, the brother's family, because Syrian society is patriarchal. Okay? The father is the head of the household. The male figure is the protector of the family. The male figure takes on the side of things that some things are left to the woman. And I'm going to say things here a lot of people are going to disagree with, but I'm just telling you the facts. Okay? I certainly disagree with a lot of things of my culture, but the facts are the facts. Right? The women are sometimes, in some communities, and I don't like to generalize, but some communities are told to stay at home, to take care of matters of the family, tend to the kids, raise the kids, etc., while the husband is out providing for the family. And so with the recent conflict, with a lot of situations where the men cannot provide for the family, it causes a lot of stress onto them, and distress and problems. And now they feel like they need to take their own lives because they have this one role and they can't fulfill it. So it's a divided society, it's patriarchal. That's important to know going in now to the refugees in neighboring countries. And this, I believe, is the lovely Zatari camp, where there is no law enforcement, makeshift schools, makeshift clinics. Some of my volunteers have worked in the camps in Lebanon. Actually, our colleague, who is a PSR, privately sponsored refugee, actually at the office, he used to work at Zatari camp. He's seen it. He's seen what things are like. And this is what it looks like. Unfortunately, it's a camp full of tents, but in a way, this is amazing that you see resilience, that people have actually turned it into a city. People need to continue their lives, right? And I think one thing is known about refugee communities is that they show a lot of resilience. And the place on the left right here, the sort of shop, pop-up shop, is actually shawarma. So you take a Syrian out of Syria, can't take the shawarma out of his heart, So these are the makeshift schools. Okay. Now this could get destroyed in a storm. So again, school attendance is not high. We've seen kids with 4 years being out of school, 5 years. A kid that's 7 has never seen a school. Unfortunately, we hear a lot of very sad stories that come out of kids in their first few days of school. A kid stealing the lunch of another kid because that's what he's used to. A kid going to the bathroom in the class, in the corner. And I'm not lying, this has happened. Because these kids have not been in school. When you grow up and the first thing you see in life is a camp, what on earth are you going to think when you come into a room that looks like this, right? So, unfortunately, there are a lot of sad stories. The camps are very bad, by the way. They're really, really bad. The tents can't hold up anything, right? They seep water. They get blown over by the winds. There's even one incident where a volunteer of mine who's a nurse, she said that because the tent would seep water and the women don't have anything to cover their babies with, they put them in plastic bags. Like, come on, Okay, so moving on to what happens in Canada when they come in. Now, like I mentioned, we have the government-sponsored, the private-sponsored. Two different groups because each have different levels of support. The government will tell you the reason they take on these high-need families, even though you think that they should be privately sponsored, is because private sponsors don't have the expertise with dealing with the needs of these families. That's what I've heard. But I personally like the private sponsor groups because sometimes they're a group of 20. 5 of them are doctors of all kinds, right? 2 of them are lawyers. One's an HR manager. One's an artist. And so the family is set in all things regarding to life. The family does not need to sort of lift a finger. Everything comes to them, which is great because that's what's nice. But there's also the honeymoon period, right? There's the honeymoon period where the family comes in, they receive all this sort of generosity, they're overwhelmed. But then when things start rolling, they realize that, okay, it's cold, everything's far, I have to take the TTC, I'm used to walking. Scarborough is far, Scarborough's cold, North York is cold. I think that's when, from my sort of very simple knowledge of mental health, that problems might occur at a later stage. They might show up later because in the beginning it was that honeymoon period. So I just want to say this because we need to be there. We need to be there for them. So what kind of service obstacles are we facing here? Well, the language barrier. The language barrier is massive. Honest to God, people complaining about housing, about jobs, etc. I fully understand. It's a challenge, definitely. But all of that is nothing compared to changing the minds, changing people's attitudes, changing people's perceptions. The culture shock is a really, 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 really big shock, especially for those coming from Syria. I can't stress that enough because I've lived in Saudi Arabia, I've lived in Dubai. Dubai is a very rich country. I've lived in Yemen. Yemen's a very poor Arabic country. Okay, some countries are closer to what Canadian culture could be, but Syria is not one of those countries. It's a much different country in terms of culture, in terms of economic status, so on and so forth. So when these Syrians come in here, we're finding ourselves as acting as this culture bridge to the culture gap that exists. We're not only providing interpreters and etc., that's great, but an interpreter will find themselves all the time explaining to the sponsor group why the person did this or that and why the person said this and what that means. So on that note, I'd like to just say, tell you about a couple of things regarding the idioms of distress that Sidonia referred to. And they're both interesting and funny. And so, for example, it's very common in Syria, my mom uses this word a lot, to say faratut. Faratut translates to I am in pieces. Okay? It sounds funny, like what does that mean, I am in pieces? But it actually, and this is a really interesting, nifty report by the UNHCR that was put together, so do check that out. They translated it and then also explain what it means. And it means general state of distress, sadness, extreme tiredness, inability to open up and to control oneself or to hold one together. So the reason I'm saying this is that the language barrier is not just the only thing there. It's also the culture barrier. Like faratat is not used in Egypt. It's not used in Dubai. It's only used in Syria.
Used here too.
I felt the pieces?
Yeah,
okay.
Sure.
So there you go. So not only do service providers need to know what this means, but also the interpreter interpreting for them. And so everyone else as well. Another one is حاسس روحي عم تطلع. It means I feel my soul is going out. It's explained as worrying, being pessimistic, inability to cope, being fed up, etc. Okay. Yeah. And so this report is really cool because it has it in Arabic and Kurdish as well. Okay, so yeah, we're trying to provide interpreters to all these sponsor groups. Use us as a source of language if you need us, language support services. We prefer the dialects from Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine, but Syrians will understand Egyptian, Iraqi, etc. Okay. So, in regards to medicine, mental health, etc., what are the healthcare system in general? What do Syrians, what should we expect? We should expect that they don't know much, if anything, about our healthcare system and the way it works here. Like I said, it's different over there. If you need an x-ray, you just go and get an x-ray, right? You don't have to get a referral. Or an MRI, you just go and get an MRI, literally. In Syria, a lot of people will go and seek help in groups. So maybe the mom's only sick, but then the whole family will go. I don't know, just moral support. I love it. I think it's a great idea. Again, more descriptive communication around symptoms, like I said. Very sort of exaggerated, elaborate, even poetic sometimes, descriptions of distress. One-way reception of services. So in Syria, for a lot of reasons, you go to the doctor, and the doctor is a very authoritative figure. The doctor will tell you, you will go do this, you will take this medicine from here to then, and you will do that, and that's how you get better, right? In some communities, it's worse than others. But this means that here, we need to sort of engage the patient, the client, the newcomer, in sort of the type of medication or not medication, but like the type of service they receive. Like, what do they prefer? Sort of engage in dialogue. Don't just be sort of, this is what you're going to do, this is what you're going to do. Lack of trust around confidentiality. There's no such thing as consent forms in Syria. It's just known. Your doctor won't sort of spread the word about what you have. So again, consent forms, confidentiality agreements, they're all new for a lot of Syrians out there, those that haven't really left Syria or maybe not left the town that they're from. Stereotypes, please. These are the things we want to prevent. Don't just talk to the male figure because he's the head of the household. Please talk to everyone in the family. The stereotype is that women do not make decisions. Let's not perpetuate these stereotypes. This is not Syria. We don't need to think that we have to speak to them as if they are in Syria. Let's speak to them as if they are in Canada, which they are. If you see someone who you think that because of their religion they won't be accepting of this certain medical treatment, don't make that assumption, right? Ask them, for example. Now you know that I didn't tell you, but it's illegal actually to have. Excuse me, sorry. So it's illegal. Homosexuality is illegal in Syria. Okay, it's part of the law. Among consenting adults, same-sex acts are illegal. So knowing that, don't don't find it disrespectful to discuss sexual orientation with a Syrian newcomer. Don't assume that because in Syria this is something that isn't really talked about, that here it should not be talked about. I know this is obvious, but these are just things we'd like to recommend. Shame and shyness discussing sexual history and reproductive health. Yeah, sex wasn't really talked about in Syria. Like, it's as a topic, you don't talk about it. Fathers don't have talks with their sons. You know what I mean? Even husband and wife, certain topics are avoided and left to other members of the community to discuss. But what that means and what happens in result is that sexual problems are not talked about when they should be, STDs, etc. So knowing that, don't make assumptions that you shouldn't bring up certain things to make those people uncomfortable. In fact, do what you need to do to treat the problem correctly, right? And that's what we're looking for. Check assumptions and stereotypes. Always ask. It's never offensive. It's never a negative thing. Introduce your role and how you'll be caring for them. It's new. It's all a new system. Say who you are. Introduce yourself. Don't assume that they're going to know that person referred you and they sent them. Really, it's all so new, like I said. Simple language, yeah, avoid use of labels. So they're fully on board and comprehending everything. Explain consent, like I said. And use any kind of tools from health equity departments. That's always good. And also, when in doubt, just ask. Okay. Thank you so much. These are some resources that we found very useful. This is not the exhaustive list, so if you feel like there's anything else that you would be interested in, feel free to reach out. Again, some more resources. Okay. And I can always send these to you guys. This is my contact info if you ever need it. Be happy to answer any questions you have. So I hope I provided a good sort of background, give you a brief idea about Syrian culture and what to expect of the Syrians that are coming here. Because obviously the more we know, the better our service will be. Okay, thank you so much.